Hey Trip,
There.
how's it going?
Awesome. Happy
Great to
Tuesday.
have you here.
Here
uh,
in Santa Barbara, it's Takeout Tuesday.
uh, Here in New York, I wouldn't say it's Taco Tuesday right now, but some quiet times. But Trip, we're really excited to have you here, on
Great to
Instagram
be here.
Live. I speak for a number of gamers out there that you represent a big part of our childhoods. And so I know you have kids, and I'm not sure how well aware they are about like all these grown adults that idolize you. It probably would creep them out if they realize like, well, there's all these like guys who are just like enamored by their father. But you meant a lot to us, and so we're really excited to have you on board to do this interview with you. Mainly because you've done so much for the gaming industry, and it's amazing, like all the past like 3 decades, your contributions to gaming that you've provided. And so we want to do this interview in a way where we can pretty much get to know all the things that we've always wanted to know from you, and not just the typical
Okay.
stuff that everyone has asked and everything, but it's quite interesting. It's funny because most people will always talk about your days at EA. They'll always talk about your days at running 3DO. But it's actually one of the things that people tend to forget was that you were one of the early members at Apple.
That's right.
And
That's right.
it's really funny because one of my favorite movies is the Steve Jobs movie from Aaron Sorkin. And when the movie came out 5 years ago, if you and I'm not sure how well aware you are of this, but there was a lot of talk on fan messages, on fan forums and 3DO forums that they had the right actor playing Steve Jobs in Michael Fassbender, but that he uncannily looks like you. And in a way, they feel that he should be playing actually you in a way that if you were to ever have your
That is
story
funny.
or
I've
have
never heard that.
yeah, no, it's crazy. And if I actually were to do like a side-by-side comparison of it, people are like, whoa, he really does look like Michael Fassbender. Michael Fassbender looks like Trip Hopkins, or Trip Hopkins looks like Michael Fassbender. So
That's a new one for me.
yeah. So it's pretty crazy because you were actually part of the Apple Lisa team during that time, from my knowledge. So I guess if there's any background you can provide, like what it was like working on the Lisa, because obviously that was in a way somewhat a controversial product from Apple, because it was the whole tensions that Steve Jobs had with like the board and whatnot. But if you can just tell us about the experience of like the product development, and it's actually quite interesting from a lot of the research that people have done on the Lisa, was that the whole GUI system, you played a very big part about that. And
I did.
so,
I did.
for a lot of people right now who take for granted using a mouse and be able to click a window, right now, guys, I just want let you all know that Trip Hopkins played a big part in making what we do right now with computers, the whole Windows system of clicking X off a window. That was you. So yeah, like if you could just describe like how that whole design process and just the whole development process of working with Steve Jobs, and specifically on the Apple Lisa, because that was like his pet baby in a way that he really wanted to champion.
Yeah, well, when I first got there, it was a very young company, basically in the hobby computer industry. We made and sold maybe 150 hobby machines a month, and those machines, adjusted for today's dollar, they would have cost in today's dollar between 5 and 10,000.
Wow.
So this is for a hobby machine that really couldn't do very much. And right away, I started working with the founders, and they basically said, "Hey, Trip, go figure out how we can sell these to businesses." And I figured out that the promising market that we should focus on was the Office desktop, and and we just started working towards that goal. So among other things, I brought the first spreadsheet software into Apple. I knew I wanted to get a mouse, and so I hired a guy that had previously worked at Xerox, and he knew someone, and we were able to smuggle a mouse, a Xerox mouse, into Apple that way. And then later on, there was a small group of us that sat around in a room for weeks, discussing the design debating and deciding things like how many buttons there should be on a mouse. I still believe, and Steve believed, that it should be one. In a way, once we got to smartphones, it went back to one. You're using kind of one finger. And, same thing with the scroll bars. That was a fascinating discussion about, which you have a scroll bar, and at the end there's going to be arrows. Which way should they point? Funny thing is, everybody thinks we were copying Xerox, but Xerox actually had a really complicated user interface. They even had your left hand on a device called a cat. Nobody talks about that, but that was a terrible idea. And the mouse had 3 buttons, too many in my opinion. One of the Xerox engineers that Apple hired later, he thought there should be 6 buttons on the mouse because that's how many the bartenders could handle when they were, putting scotch and other liquors into
That's very odd.
house
That's
drinks.
a very odd logic to me.
I remember to this day thinking that is a crazy idea. What's the, why do you think that? And it really, we're talking about what professional bartenders can handle. And the scroll bar conversation, again, it was some of the guys that had been at Xerox. They were insisting that no, the arrows have to be the other way, because technically when you hit that button, it's going to move the text in the direction of the arrow. I'm going, that is not the way the user is going to look at it. The way the user is going to look at it is, here's what's on the screen, and I want to see where it came before, and it's up there. So I have to go up there. It doesn't matter that the text is actually going to be moving down. My eye wants to go up there to see what's out of view in that direction. And I think we made the right decision about that. And there are standards from that user interface design that are still around today after all these years. Of course, what happened with the Lisa project is a lot of those people migrated over to the Macintosh team. And, it basically, that whole technology vein from Lisa through the Mac, was a lot of the same people, a lot of the same core ideas. And it actually just took much longer to get the market to shift. Obviously, Steve spent about a decade at Apple before he was pushed out. And in that decade, the Apple II was a great product. It sold really well for many, many years, longer than anybody thought it would. And Steve basically got pushed out because the Macintosh wasn't selling that well. Yet, obviously, give it another 5-10 years, it finally took off, and it's still around today.
Wow. So I guess like a lot of contention was the naming of the Lisa.
Well, not really.
I guess,
not really. I'll be honest with you. That was not a democratic process. I wanted to call it the Apple I, because the whole user experience was about there being just one way of doing things. And therefore it being very simple to learn and simple to use and easy to remember what to do, because you only have one choice. And of course, Steve was personally offended because there had already been an Apple I. I wanted to have it O-N-E, right out the word. Nobody remembered that there was a hobby kit called the Apple I, Roman numeral I. There were about 150 or 200 of those sold back in the 1976 timeframe, before the Apple II came out in 1977. And of course, he thought, no, we can't do that. There's already been an Apple I. He was too sentimentally attached to the original. And he named it Lisa. He named it for his daughter. Of course, he denied naming it for his daughter for quite a long time. I've actually met her. She's an interesting character.
Yeah.
And nobody really ever gave him a hard time about the name.
Wow. So I guess that you're dispelling the myth that a lot of people kind of right now just thought like it was kind of like an innuendo or a hidden thing, but you're pretty much.
Well, a lot of people thought it was an acronym. It was never an acronym.
Yeah.
Well, I think people started to make up stuff that it stood for. It's the same thing with 3DO. 3DO is not an acronym either. It's just the 3D with an O sound, because of all of the other media types that end in an O sound, like audio, video, radio, Nintendo. So it's just 3DO. That's it. That's the meaning.
Wow. That's pretty cool to know that it was just kind of, it just happened, so to speak, in the way how it's sounding. For a lot of gamers right now, the 3DO is just it just sounds so natural.
Well, I think it worked out to be a good name, but there was a lot of debate about it. Several of us discussed and debated a lot of different names. I didn't really have the right answer. I just said it's got to end in that O sound. And I was just talking to my wife about this a couple of days ago as we drove past the street, and the name of the street was Medio, Medio. And I thought, wow, that'd be a great name. You know, media and the O sound, Medio. Nobody's used that. The trademark's available. And then I found out that in Spanish, it means medium or mediocre. And I thought, no. You know, you're looking for a name that you can trademark and that, you know, can be, you know, something that works on a global basis if possible. You know, you have to imagine that you're going to be out there selling all over the world.
Wow. Now you know, obviously left Apple to start Electronic Arts, but had you had stayed with Apple, what would have been, I guess, the trajectory that you feel like, what, I guess, historically, what might have been different?
You know, it's a really good question. You know, Steve, in a way, wanted me to stay, but didn't want me to become too powerful because he had that much respect for me. And so, you know, from a political standpoint, you know, it was clear that at some point, you know, he and I were going to grow enough that he was going to have a hard time letting me really be and do what I was fully capable of. Obviously, I left on my own because I'd always planned on starting a game company and had kind of worked towards the founding of Electronic Arts for more than 10 years before I actually started it. So I was pretty committed to that plan the whole time. In some respects, I delayed it because I was having a really meaningful experience at Apple. And after 4 years there, we had 4,000 employees, billion-dollar-a-year business. It was quite a ride. But after the mid-'80s, when Apple had a lot of issues and the leadership changed, you know, frankly, as they got into the 1990s, they had a really hard time finding people who could effectively lead the company. And I don't know what would have happened to me, but there were a few CEOs in the 1990s that were below me in the org chart. In fact, in some cases, multiple levels below me, that eventually were offered that job and failed at it. And I'm not trying to say that I would have done that job any better. The Steve Jobs that came back to Apple, oh my God, without any question, in my opinion, he's the greatest CEO in history. The funny thing is, his first tour of duty, when we were working really closely, I didn't think he had the qualifications to be a CEO. He's too emotionally immature, and he had all those issues with how he treated people. And the second time around, he had really matured as he was still a ruthless, angry business person, but he really knew what to do to lead a business, and he knew how to make sure he had the right people in the room to help him do it. And the execution of what he did with Apple in his second tour of duty there, and the fact that he was doing Pixar is kind of a second hobby.
Yeah.
I mean, your hobby is to sell a company to Disney for $8 billion. I mean, wow. I mean, yeah, it's just incredible what he did the second time around. And the only part of the story of Steve that's really sad is that he just remained angry. He never really sorted out his personal demons. I felt like I understood it. In fact, when he was terrorizing people 40 years ago, people would say to me, because I seem like the rational one. I mean, I can get angry too, and be very demanding. But at Apple, they thought of me as being the contrast to Steve. And so people would come to me after having a horrible experience with him, and they say, "What is the deal with that guy?" And I would say, "Well, it's very simple. He was given up for adoption at birth. He's really pissed off about it, and he's going to make so much noise, and he's going to stand out above human beings so much that all of humanity will see him, including his biological parents, and he's going to make them feel their shame for giving him up for adoption." And lo and behold, the guy actually pulled that off, and he found out where his biological parents were. They found out about him. He reconciled with his mother, and then he chose not to reconcile with his father, and he kind of carried that anger around for a couple of decades. And I just really feel sad about that part of his life experience, because I think what we've learned about anger is that more than anything, you're directing it at yourself, and some of it is coming out and it's getting expressed, but you're just really tearing yourself up inside.
Mm. And so, Steve was known for just like, ensuring his people were loyal to him. So when you were leaving to found EA, did he have kind of?
He was really pissed. And it got worse because I've never been uncomfortable with the truth, and I've never been uncomfortable about talking to the media and, being willing to be critical. For example, one of the things they say is don't ever say anything critical about your competition. I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. I'm trying to beat my competition, and they're saying critical things about me. Hey, let's well, we're gonna have a little a fight about it. But basically, Apple started to have some of its missteps, and they would often ask me, "What do you think about what's going on at Apple?" And I would give them my honest opinion about it. And boy, yeah, Steve did not care for that either.
Wow. And so did he know exactly why you were leaving? Did he know exactly, I'm going to start?
Oh, yeah. And, look, Steve and I were very close. We hung out a lot personally. And, there was obviously a friendship that ended when I left because he was pretty upset about it. But he continued years later. He invited me to all the premieres of the Pixar films, and I'd bump into him occasionally, in social life. And it's funny because he wanted to make it sound like he'd never heard of Electronic Arts and that it was a completely unimportant company. That was pretty funny.
and the crazy thing, obviously, like when he was booted out of Apple, that's when Electronic Arts was like on the rise in the 80s. So he had to have probably seen like, hey, these were my guys that came from Apple, and then now here's they are, pretty much conquering in the software world. So that I'm sure he was probably thinking about that quite a bit. Did you ever think, though, before he rejoined Apple in 96, 97, that there might have been a possibility that you two might be working together again in some capacity?
The funny thing about Apple is that they never really embraced games, and they, to a degree, they still don't. And I did a lot of business with Apple, a lot of meetings, a lot of conversations, and it was just something where they just could never really take it seriously. And think about it, they've never acquired, for example, a meaningful game company. They've never felt comfortable publishing any first-party Apple games. It's it's unfortunate. I think in some respects it's okay when you think as a platform company that you want to be an independent platform and let the third parties handle all the software. But I don't think it always works that well that way.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that because I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in your career where, when you had the 3DO released, that's when Apple kind of did that deal with Bandai to release the system called the Bandai Pippin. I'm not sure how well aware you are.
Yeah, I know all about it.
I guess what was your opinion when you saw that come out around the same time that you were releasing the 3DO?
Yeah, the Pippin was a non-starter. So what happened with it is pretty much what I expected.
Wow. And jumping back to your days at Apple, what do you feel would have made the Lisa a success? I guess, like, you kind of left right before it was about to come out, but what you think was like the X factor that, just didn't like carry it in the mainstream?
Well, there were some silly problems with it. One of which was that Steve, at one point, he was frustrated with our suppliers of disk drives. And so he thought, well, we should make our own disk drive. That was way too ambitious a thing to do. And then, of course, he forced the Lisa project to use it because, of course, hey, this is our disk drive. We have to use it ourselves. And it never really worked quite right. So it just made the Lisa machine kind of unpredictable and unreliable. And then meanwhile, after he took over the Macintosh project, guess what he did? He sourced the disk drive from Sony, a very reliable manufacturer. So in a way, there was it's almost like there was corporate sabotage because he was upset at being removed from an operating position when the company went public back in 1980. And he ended up taking over the Macintosh team just so he'd have something to get his hands on. And then it became important to him to prove everybody wrong and make that into a big success by having it beat out what else was competing for resources within the company. You know, and not a very mature thing to do at that time. Obviously, the core ideas. I mean, in fact, Microsoft Windows only was able to use the core ideas from Apple because they had a license agreement to do so. Wow. And they got that license agreement in the mid '80s from Steve Jobs because he wanted their apps on the Mac. And the only way to get those apps on the Mac was to essentially give Windows permission to violate Apple's IP. And, wow. And Steve was really smug and convinced that Windows is they wouldn't know how to do it. It's never going to be any good, and we're going to beat them in the market any place. And everybody's going to prefer Apple devices like the Mac. Yeah, good luck with that.
And it's we're actually getting quite a bit of questions right now in regards to your time at Apple. Here's just one question that came in. What was the biggest takeaway you ever got from Steve Jobs?
Yeah, I have a really clear memory of this because, of course, he's a really brilliant guy and famously creative. And I've never really, up to that point in my life, I didn't have a clear picture of whether or not I was creative. And one day Steve Jobs said, you know, Tripp, you're really creative. And I thought, wow, if Steve Jobs says I'm creative, then maybe I am creative.
Well, a lot of gamers now believe you were a creative vision. So, I mean, in retrospect, yeah, definitely were.
But it's funny, isn't it? There are really core things about who we are and how we end up being in the world that we have doubt about.
Yeah. When you look back on those days in Apple, does it ever, I guess, when you were there, did it kind of, were you, I guess, that presence of knowing that, wow, I'm part of like this historical movement in a way that, you know, how Apple is now, where it's kind of like a cult of, you know, brand personality, so to speak. Did you kind of have that feeling when you were there back then?
Very, very much. I mean, just from the very first minute that I was there, there was a very strong culture amongst the early employees, because you pretty much had to be incredibly passionate about trying to do something that was kind of impossible and unlikely and risky. And then, you know, there were just other character traits that everybody shared. And it helped cement in me the importance of really consciously planning to have an organizational culture and have a set of values that everybody rallies around. And of course, when the company grew, I mean, in the time I was there, we just added thousands of people. And it's really, really difficult to maintain a culture when it grows that fast. And I went to the founders and said, hey, you know, there's so much hiring from these other companies that the culture of those companies is coming in and kind of taking ground, taking over different floors and areas of buildings. And they agreed with me that it was, yeah, it's really important for us to have a culture. So Tripp, why don't you go work on that and go figure that out? So actually I did that, but the lesson I took away from it is that if the founders and the CEO are not the embodiment of how the communication to the rest of the staff is about the culture, if they're not the ones that are really emphasizing it, and it comes down to, you know, how you communicate with people and who you're trying to hire and why, and then who you're promoting, you know, it's really got to be led by the founders. And yeah. They just never really thought it was that important, you know. So again, I think that helped the company decline in the 1980s, and yet that feeling about the brand and the original vision that Apple had, and the values around design and the products, that has always been there, you know. So that never went away, and as the company came back later, you know, that really became their badge of honor.
Yeah. And a quick technical question that just came through. What OS did you work up to while at Apple?
You know, they didn't have fancy names and fancy numbers then. You know, and in fact, the memory on these machines was very small. I mean, the first Macintosh, this was, you know, a big debate I had with Steve Jobs, where he was saying that I think he actually said at one point that 64 kilobytes of RAM would be enough for the Mac, because he was trying to hit a lower price point. And I was saying, no, it's going to have to be way more than that. And of course, they launched it, I think, with 128K, and you couldn't do anything. And then it doubled to 256K. And even that's a small amount of space, because you have to have the operating system, and then you have to leave plenty of that available for an application. And boy, nowadays, that's just such a crazy small amount of memory that you can hardly do anything with.
I don't think you can even get a calculator on that now with that kind
yeah,
of memory.
Of course, you know, my favorite example, though, is the Atari video computer system, the 2600, their best-selling game console. It had 128 bytes of memory. So not 128 kilobytes or megabytes. It was 128 bytes.
I think if I did one equation in Excel, I think that's how much memory that is right there.
Or you can make it on.
Yeah, that is crazy. It's crazy the stuff that you guys were able to do in the 70s and 80s with kind of that limited memory. So I kind of want to just go into your days at Electronic Arts. And, you know, obviously you came from Apple, which was like a really cool marketing style of, I guess, they made the marketing of computers different. It wasn't kind of how, you know, how people thought of computers back in the 80s. It was consumer friendly. And so when you created Electronic Arts, you essentially turned PC games and kind of turned them from like dingy old diskettes and baggies and made them cool with like really awesome packaging that was very reminiscent of, you know, the recording industry. And, you know, that's one of the things that you're known for in terms of like the gaming innovations that you made to the industry, was that you essentially brought a sophistication and a culture of art essentially to the medium.
Yes, thank you.
So I guess like my big question is, in looking back on it, what were kind of your influences, you know, obviously the industry specifically, but in terms of like the actual art style of like how you should have done the design of the packaging, where did you kind of take these influences from? Because we look back at a lot of the art style of a lot of these like albums, or sorry, a lot of these games, and they're, you know, they have this very abstract art look on it.
Yeah, there's a lot of fun stuff that was done there. So I was looking, I knew I wanted to start this company, and I kept thinking about it and trying to figure out what's going to anchor my strategy for the company. I really wanted to have a big idea, and I eventually realized that it was really about the idea of software as an art form, and, you know, games as a new medium for, you know, creative expression. And I realized that, wow, in the history of software engineering, nobody's really thought about engineering this way, and that this is a big idea. And of course, I had a great reference point. It's really helpful in innovation. You know, you're trying to do something new, but it's really helpful if you can find another industry or another product category where they've done something analogous, where you can draw from what experience what was gained there. So as an example, for Apple, the consumer electronics business was a reference point. If anybody that's manufacturing and selling TVs and music equipment or even appliances, they've had to deal with basically distribution problems and pricing and manufacturing issues, kind of like Apple had to. And we ended up modeling our Apple retail dealer program around principles that were successful with consumer electronics. And I knew that was a good reference point even for Electronic Arts. In fact, I was influenced as to use the word electronic in the name. And at the same time, it wasn't the most important reference point. I realized that with this idea of software as an art form and the developer as an artist, my reference point would be Hollywood. And so I just started studying Hollywood. And what's interesting is that one of the important things that they do is they like to get as close as they can to the customers. So they don't want to just develop the thing and turn it over to a producer and have that producer turn it over to a distributor, and the distributor sell it to a retailer, and the retailer sell it to the public. They wanted to get all the way out to the retailer, so that basically they could talk to retailers about what customers are doing and just really pick up on that vibe of the consumer and learn more about what they wanted and figure out how to fight that battle with the competition in those retail stores. Well, Apple had been through an interesting experience where we were selling through distributors, but the distributors couldn't scale fast enough. They didn't have enough working capital. They couldn't borrow enough money or raise enough capital. So at Apple, about 2, maybe 3 years into my experience at Apple, we went direct to retail, and it was complete chaos because one minute we had 6 accounts, 6 regional distributors, and now suddenly we got 4,000 mom and pop retail stores around the country, and we have to have a direct relationship and get their purchase orders and ship them their products and manage those relationships. It was chaos. So when I realized that Hollywood also sold direct, I began to kind of put it together and realize that, yeah, there's really fundamentally good business reasons for doing this. And I'll just do it from the beginning. And of course, nobody had ever done it with games or even software, third-party software. I remember, some of you might remember Lotus 1-2-3. Well,
yeah.
Some of the same venture capital firms funded that company and funded Electronic Arts. And we had products that came out in similar timeframes. They only ever had one customer for it. They sold it to a distributor named SoftCell. And then SoftCell sold it to all the retail stores. So it's funny because that's how prevalent that presumption was. Oh, we're not going to sell it to retail. Nobody can do that. And everybody was predicting that Electronic Arts would be out of business in a year because we were just crazy that it was never going to work selling directly to the retailers. And I just really believed in it. And it was very painful because it took like 3 years to really get it going and get it working. But after that, it became an incredibly strong corporate strength and major strategic advantage for the company.
And it's funny for a lot of retro gamers now, Trip. One, there's the sales strategy that you also planted, which is like brilliant. But also just even from a packaging standpoint, it's something that as retro gamers that we miss.
Yeah, they're more collectible, obviously. But where I started on that, you'll just laugh because I was thinking about, okay, these are artists. We want to present it kind of like a record album. And I thought, yeah, not only that, record albums must be really inexpensive to manufacture because they were in retail stores for like $6. And I'm thinking, well, shoot, I got to go find the guys that make the cardboard albums because they'll be able to make something inexpensive. Well, it turned out that we went to the largest maker of record albums in the world. And they said, well, shoot, we can actually save you even more money than that. My original thought was we're going to put them in actual record albums. Somebody's already making those in incredible volume. But basically, that company said the cost is based on how much paper there is. So if you make it smaller, it's less paper and it's even cheaper than the album. And we were able to come up with that fold-out design where you've got the little slot to put the disc in and the slot where you can put the manual in, and then you've got a gatefold where you could just go to town on the art and the interview with the artists and the photography. And yeah, it was a really fun factor. But that particular style, what happens is that in retail stores, as they start to pile up the products on the shelves, they turn them sideways to fit more on, kind of like library books.
Yep.
And if you're too narrow, nobody can see what the product is.
So it's all based on width. So it's crazy that you mentioned how like the packaging is
So anyway, just saying that's why it eventually faded. Yeah. There were I kept track because a lot of competitors copied our albums, literally exactly copied them. At one point, there were 22 companies that were publishing in our record album format.
Wow.
And I wasn't really all that happy about it, but eventually all that went away because you had to get wider. You had to be in a box so that people could see the name clearly on the spine.
Wow. And it's funny, the way how you described the packaging, Trip, if a game came out like that now, that's considered a collector's deluxe edition. It's really funny how like, wow, like we really took these things for granted back in the day.
It's funny you say that because that's actually an obvious idea. It really be smart for Electronic Arts or any company because they do everything. A lot of stuff is just done digitally, so there is no packaging. But heck, I'm sure a lot of people would love to buy a limited edition version of a product, whether it's Warcraft or Call of Duty or Fortnite or FIFA or Madden. They'd probably love to get a fancy limited edition package that has that album style.
Yeah, with, done in the album style. That'd be
with liner cool. notes and,
yeah.
and details and beautiful imagery, and that'd be awesome.
Wow. And so kind of during your time at EA, obviously the big thing that you did, one of the biggest things you done was the Madden series. And a question just actually came in that was, quite interesting. It's that if Madden had said no to endorsing, what would you have done? I guess, like, who would have been your next guy?
Well, the funny thing there is that I originally didn't want to have a brand name football personage and have to pay royalties for that. I knew a lot about football because I played football, and at one point I thought about becoming a football coach. And my best friend actually did become a football coach. And I thought, I want to get some help, but they don't have to be the brand. EA can have its own brand, but I want somebody to fill in kind of some gaps in my knowledge about football. And the first guy that I talked to was Joe Kapp. He had quarterbacked the Minnesota Vikings. And at that time, he had become the head football coach at the University of California in Berkeley, near our office. So I, reached out and contacted him, and he and I got together. And I was basically saying, I can hire you on a consulting contract, pay you some money, and we have some meetings, and I interview you, answer some questions, and do you want to do that? And so he seemed like he really wanted to do it. And then he got back in touch later after we met and said, I've decided I want my name on it and I want to get royalties. And then I thought, if I'm going to have to pay royalties and have somebody's name on the box, what is the number one name? Because I'd already had Dr. J with the first EA Sports game. Dr. J and Larry Bird go 1-on-1. And Dr. J, he was either number one or number two as the most famous, popular athlete in the world. I mean, he was really popular. I said, yeah, just go to the top of the pile. I mean, let's figure out who's up there. And John Madden really stood out. He was the ace hardware man. He was breaking through the paper at the Miller Lite beer commercials. He was obviously already an Emmy award-winning broadcaster. He'd written a few books that had done well enough to be in paperback. So I really wanted to work with him. I had to offer them more money. But at the end of the day, it's show me the money, and maybe they could have convinced me to pay more if they were like way out of our league financially. And sometimes that happens because people just don't understand what your cost structure is, and they don't understand that they're asking you to lose money, which you can't really do and stay in business. But after Madden, if John really had no interest, then I would have just kept working my way down the list. And I definitely had interest in having a coach more than an individual player, because I just didn't feel like you could really build an entire team sports brand just around an individual athlete. And I needed design help on the game from a coach.
Yeah, if you think about that decision, how radical of a decision even back then. Imagine like a game that would come out like now, like Bill Belichick football. People feel like, what? It's crazy to know that when you chose Madden to be your guy and, basically have him be the one to have his name on the franchise. I'm sure like people back then were probably like, wow, this is like, a very unique perspective. Granted that he was like the coach of the Raiders.
Something to keep in mind is that I would say at least for maybe 5 years, the first 5 years of Madden, a lot of video gamers didn't really know who he was.
Yeah.
And you'd have these anecdotes from people in retail stores where some kid picks up the package and says, "Who's John Madden?" And of course, the irony is nobody asks that question anymore. Anybody that plays video games, they know exactly who John Madden is.
It's funny because when you think about it, my, younger generations will only know Madden now as like a commentator or a guy that, hey, he's like the greatest video game franchise of all time. But, you look back and it's almost like, wait, guys, he won Super Bowls, everyone. Yeah. He was a big deal before like the whole video game ever came out.
And of course, he was a really wonderful character. I mean, he's a brilliant coach, a very smart man, and he was really helpful in making the game really, really great, particularly with helping us get player data and insight about players and plays and teams, and then also the aspects of artificial intelligence that have to go into game design if you're playing against a computer, and you have to have a computer coach.
Yeah.
And then also the playbook. It would have been hard to make a decent playbook without his design direction. I mean, he really helped me understand a lot of fundamentals really well. But the other thing about John is that he's completely different when he's in a public setting. I mean, first of all, in private, every third word is an F-bomb. And in public, he never screws that up.
And that's hard to imagine.
For all those years.
Yeah, and that's hard to imagine because he's like the Ace Hardware guy, so we just only know him from the commercials where he's like everyone's favorite next door neighbor.
Yeah, and the personality that he offers as a NFL broadcast analyst, it was kind of a goofball character, almost a caricature or a comic book version of himself. And all the gestures and wham, boom, all these sound effects and the sense of humor. And later on, we all got to learn about what turducken is. And those of you that aren't sure, look it up. That's for Thanksgiving. Anyway, yeah, I mean, he is a larger than life human, and it has been a real pleasure in my life to have had the opportunity to work with him and know him. Wow.
And you have spoken that a lot of people have called the Madden project Tripp's Folly, in the sense that it was kind of like Walt's folly. Why do you think people, I guess, didn't believe in the project?
Well, back in the 1980s, it was fairly typical that if you're going to make a game, it's going to take you a year to do it. And it took us 4 years. And so everybody was pretty frustrated, including those of us working on it and John Madden. Everybody was really just kind of disturbed that it was taking so long. And basically the way I heard that behind my back, people called it Tripp's Folly, is that 1 year towards the later stages of this, the auditors, the outside accountants that come in to audit your financial statements, they came in and they told me, well, Tripp, you have this advance payment that's a advance against royalties for John Madden. And we just want to let you know that we've decided that you're never going to recoup it. And therefore it needs to be expense. It has no asset value because according to the other senior executives in the company, the product may never come out. They don't know if it's ever going to sell. Everybody seems to think it's pretty hopeless, and they call it Tripp's Folly. And of course, I was pretty comfortable and smug at that point that we were a lot closer to finishing it. And we're going to get this done. And dang it, I understand why they feel like they need to expense it. I don't really agree with that, but I'll let that pass. But yeah, this is not going to be a folly.
Wow. So we only have about like a few minutes left, so I kind of want to speed run through some of the questions that we're getting because we're getting quite a few. I do want to get to your time at 3DO because that's what fans really want to hear. One question just came in. What's your favorite game that came out on the 3DO?
The one I love to play the most was Return Fire. Return Fire, I love to play it by myself, and I love to play it, with an opponent. And I guess some other games that I really enjoyed playing would be Road Rash. Let me think here. When it first came out, there was kind of a shortage of solid apps. So I enjoyed Crash and Burn quite a bit. And there were other games later that were surprisingly fun. I got teased a lot because there was a Japanese game that where you're in a spaceship and you're shooting at enemy ships, but it was a game on rails. And
Starblade? I think it was Starblade.
I think that was later. I've forgotten the name because this game was mainly released in Japan. At 3DO, of course, we have copies of every game that's released everywhere. And, I had the equipment that could run any game. and it had a good soundtrack, and the graphics were impressive, and it didn't matter to me that I was just waiting for the right time to hit the button. I found it, thoroughly entertaining. Of course, I enjoy playing sports games like Madden and FIFA, the 6-player version of FIFA. That's the game that did the most to take advantage of the joystick design of 3DO, which was daisy chain. So in theory, you could make a game that had 16 joysticks all connected with 16 people playing off the same screen. And I've just always been a big fan of social games. And of course, the game Twisted, that was pretty much my idea, and it was kind of made at my kind of executive direction. And that game is a huge amount of fun. To this day, it's a fun, competitive family game. And I have maybe my most endearing moment of gameplay on the 3DO with my family one time playing Twisted, where I've got a grandfather and a couple of kids and myself, and then other kids watching. And of course, I've got a huge lead, and I'm literally on the last step. So no matter what happens on my next turn, I'm guaranteed to win. I'm just going to step onto the platform, and I'm going to be the winner. You can probably tell I'm a little competitive. Okay.
Oh yeah.
Now, oddly enough, I've always been accused of letting my kids win, because I just thought, I don't need to mop the floor with my kids. I don't need to constantly beat them. That's going to drive them insane and make them neurotic. I want to encourage them, and I want them to love playing games. And so I want to help nurse them along and make sure that they're not feeling like a loser and feeling defeated all the time. So, in some situations, yeah, I'm gonna let them win, and I'm gonna give them advice about what to do and help them out. But on this particular night, in that particular game, I had decided, okay, I'm gonna see how I can do here, and I'm way, way ahead. And of course, the grandfather's not really a gamer; he's dead last, way behind. And naturally, we get that thing in that game where it causes two people to switch places, and suddenly the grandfather is at the top, I'm at the bottom, and then it turns out his turn is next, and he steps onto the platform, and suddenly he's won the game, and the kids are just so excited. Oh my God, this is like the biggest upset ever. Dad lost. He lost to Opa. What the heck? And I've never really gotten more pleasure than what it's like when other gamers get a chance to beat me at a game. Oh my God, they just love it.
I think, Trip, there would be a ton of 3DO players right now that would kill for the chance to play you in Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo if they ever had that opportunity. Which people know is
I've never been good at those kinds of games. That was a great game too.
It was a good game, and people always remember it as the best arcade conversion of that game when it came out on the 3DO. Really quick, some other quick questions that come in. If the M2 had been released, what would have been the final retail name?
That's a good question. I think M2 is a decent moniker. You already want people to think of it as a 3DO, and now you've got another designation. But of course, each manufacturer that might have brought it to market, could have had their own brand, the way Panasonic did with Real. And yeah, it's a shame that on the one hand, you have a company like Sony that invested $2 billion to establish the PlayStation, and they did a great job. They made a great product. They had a lot of the right kind of plans. At one point, the Sony leaders confided in me privately that they had pretty much copied our entire developer program. So our license agreements and all the tools and just everything we were doing to help developers, they just, Xeroxed all of that. But I have a tremendous amount of respect for what Sony did. It's just that Matsushita, which was, in fact, a very comparable company, they had just won the VHS versus Betamax video battle with Sony. And they didn't have the same confidence about the game space. And Sony had actually been in the music business for a while. They had a joint venture with CBS called Sony CBS that eventually became Sony Music. Yeah. And they therefore had enough of the culture of creativity and media and artistry, and they weren't as intimidated by something that felt as new as the game business. And they spent some time paying attention to Nintendo and thinking, we could be in this market. Why don't we do something? And I had conversations with them that led me to believe there was a chance that they might end up choosing to be part of the 3DO platform network. And I think what happened is that they were just far enough along in the early design work on the PlayStation 1. And Ken Kutaragi is a brilliant genius. You know, he was worth betting on. And even though, of course, they're going to come to market later, they made that choice and they did a great job, and the rest is history. Wow.
So Trip, we only have maybe about like only 2 minutes left before Instagram Live automatically cuts us off. So I just want to make sure I kind of get to some of the points here. Guys, make sure to follow The Trip Hawkins on Instagram. It's a really great account. I would say it's not just like following a visionary, but also getting to know what life is like outside of video games, which is really great. And it's also just from a visionary standpoint, you get to see like just the life of Trip. And it's really amazing to see all the things that he's done as he reminisces like on the past. Trip, if you had to kind of look back at your legacy, what would you say would be like the most defining moment that kind of represents everything that you have stood for in the gaming industry?
You know, for me, it's always been about advocating for the nerds. You know, I'm a nerd. A lot of us are nerds. We have dealt with a lot of disrespect from other people. And that kind of continues today. And, people are kind of shy and embarrassed about even admitting that they're nerds. And it's a stigma that is rather sad and unfortunate. And I'm convinced that the world will be better off when the day comes that the nerds are running the world. So, I've spent my whole life trying to empower and enable nerds and invent crazy, amazing stuff with fellow nerds. And I'm just going to keep on doing that. And what I do these days from a work standpoint is I'm a mentor and a life coach for a lot of the next generation of technology entrepreneurs and leaders. And I'm really pleased with what I've been able to do in that consulting practice, because two of the companies that I've worked with from the very early days and worked with for more than 5 years, they're both kind of in the unicorn club now, where they're worth over $1 billion each.
Wow.
So I feel like I must be doing something right.
You definitely are. You definitely have done a lot for the culture, for gamers, just in general. I have to ask this personal question, Trip. Do you have an M2 prototype at home?
No, I don't. I've got tons of 3DO hardware and software. I probably have the best collection of software because I have all kinds of disks that are not encrypted.
Yep.
And I've got 3DO machines that have a switch on the back. Some of you have these too, I know, because they're out there. They're not supposed to be out